Ready to start whenever you are, Nicole.
Okay. I apologize. In this view, I can't really see much outside of the screen, so we'll just take some cues from you, Melissa. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome to everybody. This is the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums Digital Inclusion Workshop, addressing technology needs in Native communities. My name is Nicole Umayam, and I'm so grateful and honored to be with you today. This is often the part where a speaker gives a land acknowledgement statement. With virtual transcontinental meetings, I often wonder about the meaning of land acknowledgement statements in such a setting, especially where we are gathered from many territories, nations, and places. I'm sitting in Phoenix, Arizona, the ancestral territories of many indigenous peoples, including the Pipash, Akamil-Atam, and Tano-Atam in the Salt River Valley. They're here today. I'm far from my own homelands. I am Ilocano, an ethno-linguistic minority in the Philippines, and Finnish, raised in Seattle, Washington with my kin from Ahousaht First Nations on Flores Island in what is now British Columbia, Canada. As a professional, I represent a state agency, one with a complicated relationship to the Native nations who happen to preside within its borders. Along with my colleagues at the State Library, my professional commitment is to leverage the resources and tools that we have in service of libraries and to bring into question the institutional legacies that impact those who we serve. I wish to normalize institutional acknowledgements of care and commitment alongside land statements. This event has convened people from tribal organizations and non-tribal organizations. I invite those of you who are here today who are representing non-Native institutions to consider what commitment and allyship looks like, what it means to be in right relationship with the land and its caretakers, and how we can do our work in a good way for others. Digital inclusion means that individuals have access to robust broadband connections, internet-enabled devices that meet their needs, and the skills to explore, create, and succeed in the digital world. All of us here understand that connectivity really means survival. In September of 2017, the State Library convened the first Arizona Tribal Libraries Digital Inclusion Summit at the Oakland Indian Community Library. As we co-designed the agenda, several themes shone through: creative ways to enhance library broadband and technology, and the digital preservation and digital care of language and culture in the library. The next year, we held another summit, this time hosted by the White River Public Library. We heard again about the need to improve library broadband and technology to support culture and digital preservation of language and of the deep contexts of historic trauma that impact our communities. We met again in 2019, once again at the Oakland Indian Community Library. We discussed best practices for language work in libraries, making libraries as spaces for community archives and empowerment, and of course, broadband. We did not meet in 2020 and 2021 for reasons I'd rather not discuss here today. But now in May of 2022, we're gathered once again to talk about these same life-giving elements: internet, culture, and survival. Over the next 2 days, we'll hear from experts in these fields, not because we expect to solve problems immediately, but because we want to offer some tangible steps, connections, and examples of how to get started on this work. We know that these stories of the digital divide are ones that have persisted and are part of a much more complicated story. The story of these summits is one of coming together. The story of these summits is one of sharing gifts so that we are all stronger. The story of these summits is one of connection. This story is one of finding our way back to each other. I'd like to thank the leadership from the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums for their hard work to put this all together and to create this much needed space for sharing. Thank you to Susan Feller, Melissa Brott, and Jessica Cordes, whose careful planning and patience have helped to bring us here today. I'd like to thank the many presenters who are joining us over the next 2 days, who have generously shared their expertise and information so that we may all benefit. And I would like to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services, whose funding and support have made this event and many others possible. It's a deep joy to be here with you today. Agyamunai unai, kitos, kleko kleko, thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Crosby Kemper, who is the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, to share with us some words. Crosby?
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you once again. Great to be a part of another ATOM gathering. I'd like to make an acknowledgement, but also a statement, land acknowledgement, but also a statement. We're involved at the IMLS in America 250, which is the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. One of the things that we want to do is celebrate the history of the land going back well beyond the Declaration, well beyond the white settlement, the European settlement, which previous centennial, bicentennial, semi-quincentennial celebrations have celebrated, and celebrate the original inhabitants, the continued strength and power of Native Americans. Here in Kansas City, where I'm in my basement in Kansas City. It's land that traditionally the Osage, the Wyandotte, the Kansas, the Oto, the Missouri, they're actually, depending on how large a radius you draw around where I am in Kansas City, Missouri, there are roughly speaking 13 tribes that have called this land their home at some point. But if you go back further, and I've lived not only in Kansas City, but I've lived in St. Louis. I lived 7 years in St. Louis across the state. And in St. Louis, we're close to one of the great artifacts of Native American culture, which is Cahokia and the mounds in Cahokia. In 1100 AD, the largest city in the temperate zone of the globe was Cahokia. It was larger than London or Paris. You have to go to China to find a larger city in 1100. And Americans need to know, all Americans need to know that story, need to know the strength, the long history, the complexity, which is only really over the last 30 or 40 years, archaeology has revealed the story of so many of the pre-Columbian tribes and culture and civilization. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And that as part of our America 250 work, working in partnership with tribal organizations, with ATOM, ALA, with tribal councils across the country, I hope we can bring those stories, the pre-Columbian stories, to the celebration and commemoration of America 250. I'd also like to say today that in light of what we're talking about today, it is important to acknowledge what the Biden administration has done. As I'm sure everybody on this call is aware, the Biden administration has made tribal consultations and tribal engagement central part of its work, and all agencies, including very much the IMLS, are engaged in that. We've done a couple of two already tribal consultations, plus our ongoing work, of course, with ATOM and with the individual tribes, which goes back many years, back to our beginning, really. And I think also want to acknowledge what Congress, in a bipartisan way, has done along with the administration during ARPA, the infrastructure bill, the regular budget, the significant funding of broadband. If you add it all up, we're talking about something like $100 billion. And I chaired Shelby, Schools, Healthcare, Libraries, and Broadband, the Shelby Coalition, which is probably the strongest advocate for broadband, and particularly for broadband crossing the digital divide in the country. I chaired that organization when I was the library director in Kansas City and before I became head of the IMLS. And if you'd asked us how much it would cost us to connect everybody in this country, we probably would have used a number like $100 billion. So it's an extraordinary moment from the history of broadband that we're in. And the Biden administration has tried to make sure that tribes are a focus in this. And I think at the NTIA, the FCC, the Department of Education, the Department of Interior, and at the IMLS, we are focused on this. I know that Senator Heinrich is working on a new version of the Tribal Connect Act, which will encourage an even greater and more diverse deployment in tribal lands. And I hope that we all work together on this. One thing that we have, the GAO, the General Accounting Office, has asked all the agencies in the federal government to detail what their broadband work is. And needless to say, we have a big report that goes to them on that. But we've encouraged them. We've been talking to them, as we've been talking to the FCC, the NTIA, and we've talked to ATOM and to ALA and to tribal organizations. We need to encourage the federal government as a whole to work together on this and to make sure that the most needful areas in tribal lands, as well as elsewhere, inner cities, rural areas, but certainly tribal lands, that the most needful tribes, tribal councils, tribal organizations get this money. One of the things that we know from our work with ATOM and our work with individual tribes is that there are some folks who are large enough, who are complicated enough, who have enough help from their tribal councils or enough staff that it's easier for them to apply for these programs, our programs, any of these programs, than it is for some smaller tribes or less well resourced tribes. And we need to all be mindful. Everybody on this call, every organization, every tribal council needs to be mindful of that, so that we can help the folks who really need the help. And last but not least, I want to say, this is about use, and that I think was what Senator Heinrich is focused on. What a lot of us are focused on in Washington now, increasingly, not just connection, but use for workforce development, skill training, for education, particularly education for career orientation, and of course we're all aware of the use of the internet, the importance of broadband, the importance of connectivity for health information, and in tribal lands, in many tribal lands, of course, it's more important than it is in many places because of the dispersion, the wide open spaces that we have to travel in many cases. So it's really important that we continue to stress the importance of the usefulness, the ability to use the internet, the ability to use broadband. So that's my little speech. But mainly, I want to say it's great that we're all together again. It's great that we're working on this. You have my guarantee that this will be a continued, strong, central focus of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're proud of our work in the tribal universe. We're proud of what you all are doing under the very difficult circumstances of the pandemic and historic circumstances as well. And we want to be a part of your success, and that's our goal. Again, thank you so much for coming together today, and I appreciate being here very much. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Crosby. We really appreciate all of those words, and especially that, the interconnection of federal agencies working with Native nations, all of us in this together. Really appreciate that perspective and bringing it up. And the rest of us get to look forward to hearing a little bit more from IMLS tomorrow. So we'll stay tuned for that one. I see Miriam up on my screen, so we'll go ahead and hear a little bit from her. Dr. Miriam Jorgensen is the Research Director of the Native Nations Institute at Arizona, which is the new name of the University of Arizona down in Tucson. Miriam, would you like to share with us today?
Thanks so much, Nicole. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. And can everyone see the slide that I have up?
I'm able to, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicole. I love that you already know our new moniker. I'm still really getting used to it. I want to thank you for the beautiful words about land acknowledgement. You know, we struggle with that a lot of times in these, not just the online setting, but also when we're representing a larger land base. And I thought it was so beautiful how you talked about it. And I also want to thank Cosby Kemper, because I'm actually, while I work for University of Arizona, actually physically sitting in St. Louis, and the things that he had to say about the importance of this region for us to understand historically and how we ought to be thinking about that today as well. That these are contemporary impacts and contemporary peoples who still have strong connections to this place. This is their home. So thank you for both of you for those words. I want to share a little bit today about the survey work that's been undertaken by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And it's been funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services and also the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. This, as you know, has been an effort undertaken for almost a decade now, or a little more than a decade, of ATALM to really establish some baselines in the field and to understand change and evolution within the field. And obviously, libraries and our tribal libraries are an important place to have this conversation about digital inclusion and access to computers and access to technology. And I want to say a little bit more about that and the specific digital inclusion aspects of what we're finding in these surveys near the end of my remarks. But I want to start us off just with a little roadmap where we're going. We're going to look at what the sample was from the most recent survey, which was conducted in late 2021. Talk a lot about challenges and needs that it points to in terms of tribal libraries and technology. And then talk a little bit about funding concerns. So that's just a roadmap of where we're at going to. So first, to talk about just what we're discussing, what's on the table. At maximum in the 2021 survey, there were about 103 responding tribal libraries. And a tribal library could identify itself in more than one way. So here we've just got this little pyramid that shows these are the different ways that tribal libraries identify themselves. And about a third of libraries, a little under a third, identified themselves in more than one way. So these already from that, you can tell that what we're talking about are institutions that serve in a lot of cases, multiple purposes. Another fact about these libraries that's worth keeping in mind as we're thinking about technology and digital inclusion is simply the fact of size. So one good measure of the size of these libraries is to talk about the populations that they serve. So I want to tell you that there are two things going on in this arrow. The circles on this arrow are the actual size of the service population reported by the library. So you can see that libraries serve very small populations of fewer than 2,000 folks. And some tribal libraries serve populations as large as more than 25,000. In fact, we had a few libraries in our sample, tribal libraries, that were reporting serving populations of more than 50,000 people. But there's something opposite going on here too. If you look in parentheses underneath those population numbers, you see 52%, 21%, 16%, 6%, and 5%. Those are the proportion or percentage of the libraries, the fraction of the libraries that fall into that category. So you can immediately see that more than 50% of the libraries in the sample are serving populations of fewer than 2,000 people. And I think that it's important to remember another critical fact about this sample, and we'll be talking about this throughout, or you should be keeping it in mind throughout, is that this is a survey that was administered online. When we did the first iteration of the survey back in 2013, 2014, there was actually an opportunity for folks to fill some of it out on paper. There was some attempt at my understanding of some paper distribution here, but the majority of the surveys were filled out online. So we might even be missing some critical information from entities that were not able to answer the survey in that way. So you can kind of already tell the sort of tension there about largely conducting a survey online that's about digital access. But I do think it's important to just keep in mind that this information about population served tells us something about the size of the libraries that we're talking about in terms of access. The first thing I want to say is just some comparative information from 2013 to 2021. So late 2013 was when the first survey was conducted. I think there were a few answers collected into early 2014, but largely a 2013 survey, and then comparing to late 2021. And the question asked on the two surveys wasn't precisely the same, but it was pretty much the same to get at this notion of, do you as a tribal librarian think that your library is meeting patrons' computer and internet connectivity needs? And I think one of the big takeaways in 2013 was we saw the vast majority of tribal librarians saying that the needs of their patrons were not being met. A lot of the time they were simply not being met. We had a kind of middle category that sometimes they were being met, and a very small category, right around 10% of needs mostly met. You can see that that situation has changed quite a bit by 2021. Now, I will remind you, these are very different samples. In 2021, only 99 libraries were responding to this question, and the 2013 data represents 161 libraries. But those are still pretty big numbers that I think give us some confidence that the big takeaway here is correct, which is we've had some real movement. We've had movement into that category that says out of the needs not met, and a lot of movement into the needs sometimes met. So some of the time, maybe not in general, but most of the, there are needs that are there, and they're mostly, I guess I can't say mostly, that's the final category, but they're sometimes met, the needs are. And then there's growth in that category approaching 20% of needs mostly met. So it's not a lot of growth in that top category, but I do think it's an important change to note that there's been a lot of movement out of the needs not met into the needs sometimes met category. And that's a focus entirely on computer and internet needs. So let's turn to think about what those needs are. We surveyed a lot of them, and I'm going to just prepare you. This table has got way too much information in it, and it's hard to look at it and imagine processing it. How can you think about what this says? Right now, it's ranked on the column extremely important. Respondents had 4 options as they were ranking these more than a dozen different kinds of technology needs. The choices were extremely important, important, not very important, and not at all important. So respondents had to choose one of those for each of the categories. So you can see I've also put on this chart the other column, which is sort of the second place. Is this important? And I think that it's critical for us to take account of both of these columns when thinking about the data. If we were to rank only on extremely important, we might be missing out some of those categories where respondents were saying, it's not extremely important, but geez, it still is really quite important to us. It doesn't fall into those lower 2 categories. So I'm going to give you a little bit more information on this next slide to show you how you can start to think about ranking those things. One way to take account of the sort of dual amounts of information in these columns is to just combine them, is to add them together and ask, what proportion of the people responding to this survey actually said that this technology need was something that was either extremely important or important? And that's what that final column is. It's a combined column. It says we just straight sum to those things. But that's not the only way we could weight them. You might say, but wait a minute, people said that something was extremely important. We ought to be really paying attention to that. So I'm giving you one more way to look at this data, and it's really to combine it all and to kind of sort of find the balance in this, not losing information about what librarians were sharing with us, but also trying to understand how to ever rank this information. So here I've given you 2 or 3 different ways to look at ranking the information. One is just looking at whether or not someone was responding that was extremely important. The second one is that straight sum of those 2 columns of what proportion of the population of librarians responding said that something was either extremely important or important. And the final column gives extra weight to a sort of double weight to the percentage of the population that said something was extremely important. What do we get from this? We get some really clear and interesting rankings that come out of these needs. And that's really what we're looking for here. We want to be able to rank needs, to be able to say, what is it in terms of technology needs, broadband needs, computer needs, internet access needs, training needs, that tribal librarians say is important to them. Well, it's good to see that in any way that we rank this information, there seem to be 4 emergent top needs. One of them is free online access to subscription services. The other is Wi-Fi access in the library facility. Another is upgraded public computers and software, and another is more technology training for staff. It turns out that we don't have a lot of other information in the survey about the first and the last of those, about free online access to subscription services and more technology training for staff. I think that this shows that these are needs in communities, they're important, and of course we can understand why the first one of those things, when we are explicitly noting Ancestry.com, where a lot of citizens of Native nations are critically interested in understanding their heritage and their history. So those kinds of online subscription services, of course, would rise of importance. But we do have a lot to say from the survey about both Wi-Fi access in the library facility and upgraded public computers and software. And I want to turn to those. But before I do, I also want to point out the two things that ended up to be lowest on the list. And those are the items hotspot lending program, which either way you rank it is kind of showing up as in the third or the fourth quartile, and more public laptops for out of library use, which is really also falling to the bottom. I think that in the environment we've just been coming out of, in the pandemic environment, and knowing that a number of Native nations and tribal communities are still in a mode where there's not a lot of exit from lockdown, in a sense. There's still a lot of tentativeness about entering the public square, in a sense, that it's a little bit surprising to see these things be ranked relatively low. So I think that those are worth thinking about as we go through a little bit more of this data. So here's one of the first things I want to share with you, is that you might look at a chart like this that says, what do tribal library patrons technology, what technology do library patrons use? And librarians were responding, well, here's things we don't offer. So how could patrons possibly use it? They don't offer things like hotspots and other portable computing devices. They're just not very common in tribal libraries. And you can see that we've tried to break this out in the survey, looking at over the last 3 years and then also during the pandemic. So remember that this was a survey taken in 2021. So we're asking folks to reflect back to even the pre-pandemic period to kind of understand how needs and demands would have changed. And really, we're seeing that there wasn't a lot of this stuff being offered at all during the pandemic or before the pandemic. And you might look at that and say, oh, well, the things not offered are where the need is. But I want you to compare that to the table above and remember that hotspot lending and more public laptops for out of library use are simply just not things that tribal librarians are pointing to as something that they need. So it's kind of a warning of, don't take this, we don't offer this, as something that's indicative necessarily of need. I think it's much more indicative of how people are using or not using their libraries and what librarians think is important in terms of that use. So let's delve a little bit deeper. I wanted to look at first at public computer access, public computers with internet access. And the good news here is that amongst the 88 respondents to this question in 2021, 67% said, we are fine. We've got plenty of computers, we're doing okay. But I do think it's troubling, especially when you think about how digitized our world is, how tied in our world is, how important broadband is. And again, reflecting on some of Crosby Kemper's comments there, a full third of respondents to the sample are saying we do not have a sufficient number of public access computers that are wired for the internet. So then you might ask, well, who plans to add them? And here I think it's some interesting information as compared to 2013, 2014, when the last survey was done. Again, different samples, different numbers of respondents, but it is curious to see that at least in the raw data, it appears that there's just less plans to add computers. And a slight uptick of people who are saying that they're unsure of whether or not they're going to add. Pretty similar number of folks who are saying there's no plans to add, and that's probably not surprising given that we have 2/3 of the sample saying that they're fine with the numbers that they have. And a big uptick in other, which are suggesting things like other ways to lay hands on computers, a lot of uncertainty about what ways that people might be getting computers, and even some uncertainty in the data about capacity to add computers. And that's another thing I want to look at, because what are the barriers to putting more public access computers in place? And here's what was reported. I know this is a little bit funny of a chart to read, but it's important to look at the sort of pinky red, the first part of each bar, and see on the key below that says that pinky red color is that this has a very strong effect about whether or not we could add more of this type of technology. And so in this case, it's can we add more public computers? And the biggest driver there is availability of space. So one of the things that could be affecting folks' plans to add public computers that we saw from the previous screen, and we saw that big other category, is this thing about, well, we might plan to add them, but we can't really make a plan because we don't have available space to put them in, really signaling to us that intermixture, and you could hear this again in Crosby Kemper's remarks, between pure infrastructure issues around broadband and technology access, and then that broader infrastructure issue, which has to do with just the building space, the floor space, the type of facility overall that's available for the tribal library. Of course, second up, there is cost factors. You can see that that has a strong effect and some effect on about 70% of tribal libraries in the sample. And then down the list, less effect, but some concern about the ability to maintain and upgrade and upkeep computers, and some lower levels amounts of concern at the sort of 50% and beneath level around the amount of bandwidth and staff issues and things like that. But the big drivers there again are space above all, and then cost. So that's a little bit about public computers. I wanted to circle those two aspects. And I want to go on to talk more about internet access. Here, those of you who have heard me talk a little bit before know that we've seen some changes in these data. And one thing I really want to stress is, again, that this is an online survey. And so we might not be picking up as much information from places where internet is not as accessible. But it is interesting to see that over approximately a 10-year period, and you'll see that the first survey cited here is 2011. That's when the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums did its first comprehensive field survey of tribal archives, libraries, and museums, and happened to ask this question of what percentage of homes in your library service area have reliable high-speed internet access. The black is a decade ago, and that black is saying that in 45% of communities, there was 0 to 20% of homes had reliable high-speed internet access, and that only in 3% of reporting tribal communities, or 3% of respondents from tribal communities, were saying that 81 to 99%, or that top quintile, had reliable high-speed internet access in community members' homes. The red is the 2021, and so we're seeing a fall. There's fewer librarians who are reporting that their perception is that there are very few homes in the community that have internet access, and many more are saying that their communities are better wired. Again, different samples, different numbers of reporters, but I think the big takeaway we can have confidence in is that this has been a flattened curve. There used to be a lot more librarians who had a perception that they were serving communities that were very poorly wired. And 10 years on, librarians' perspective is that tribal communities are better wired. So that's good information. And yet the median on this, if you think about what a median means, it means 50% of the responses are beneath that number. The median is right up there around 40% of homes in the community are wired or have access to reliable high-speed internet. So that's still a little bit depressing to think that tribal communities don't have that kind of internet access at the home. It underscores, though, how important tribal libraries are in terms of providing access for those who live in these communities, for tribal citizens who live in the areas served by tribal libraries. So let's learn a little bit more about access to the internet, and especially from comparing the results of surveys. And here I've said 2014, but it really is 2013, 2014, from the last purely broadband survey of tribal libraries that we did. So here's some, I've alternated the colors here only to make the slide easier to read. So the alternating colors aren't meant to highlight anything. It's just meant to be a little bit visually easier, because I realize there's a lot of information on this slide. So 46% of 84 responding tribal libraries in 2013. So fewer than half, but still quite a few, said that they were the only provider of free public internet access in their communities. By 2021, again, different samples, but kind of a similar number of libraries, 90 responding tribal libraries, said 27% of them were the only provider of free public internet access in their communities. So we're seeing that there's fewer libraries that are like the sole provider. We didn't really ask what the other provider was. We simply asked if there was another one. Of course, we know from the experience of the pandemic that a lot of those providers are places like fast food places, the McDonald's that's just at the edge of the reservation that might provide this kind of access, or perhaps sometimes there were tribal colleges and universities that were able to turn on Wi-Fi that was available in the parking lot and things like that. But I do think it is good news to see that we're down to just over a quarter of libraries are the only provider of free public access. And here's another number from 2021 of only 3% of libraries reported that their library does not provide public internet access. So I think that's also reasonably good news. But the data are a little bit contradictory because what that 3% is reporting is a little bit confused with which libraries don't offer internet access at all. And so you see in the final bullet point, by 2021, and this is the last, I guess it's the second to last bullet point, by 2021, 88% were reporting that they were clearly providing public access. So that 3% figure above tells us kind of somewhere between 88 and 97% of libraries in our sample are offering access. And I'm still trying to sort of unwind where that difference is. Is there somebody saying that they're not offering access and what they really mean is that they don't provide any computer access, or that they have computers and they're not providing public access? So there's a little bit there to unwind, but I do think it's telling us that there may be a slight rise in the number of libraries that are providing internet access, but we're still not at 100%. And that's the real takeaway here, is that in our samples of tribal libraries, we're still not at 100% providing free public access to the internet. And guess what? For more than a decade, if you look at public libraries as opposed to tribal libraries, 100% of public libraries have been able to provide free public access since 2011 and before. So that's just something that is a bit sobering. Why is this so important? And this is where I wanted to talk just briefly about the importance of digital access in our lives and digital inclusion. Because when you start to look at the kinds of technology training that is being offered to library patrons, tribal library patrons, you start to understand how important this public access is. Because some of the things that are being offered is just general training on how to do internet searches. How do you find out about anything these days? So tribal librarians are training their patrons on that, training them in general computer skills, which are usually, include things like word processing and just basically how to, get the machine on and use it to do the very simple things you need to use. General internet use, computer software use. And here's where we get really interesting. About 55% of tribal libraries are training folks to get online job and career information. 50% are training folks to get online health information. About 45% are training them to get online information about the government. And by that, generally, people are thinking about not their tribal government, but about their state or, in fact, the federal government and federal government programs that require internet access. And then you can see right down the list of other kinds of things that people are accessing it for. But looking at this list about the kinds of demands for training for computer use and internet use, you start to understand how critical these services are provided in tribal libraries, because they really are able to create citizens who are able to be much more involved and engaged in their world within the tribal community and their world beyond the tribal community. Now, just a couple of things about funding, and then I'll wrap up. The last thing I want to say is that IMLS has been obviously incredibly important as a funder of tribal libraries. It is the thing that the most reported source of funding for tribal libraries. 74% report that they've received an IMLS basic grant. 64% of tribal libraries say that they are funded by their tribal governments. 41% have received enhancement grants from the IMLS. And the other funders, about a third of tribal libraries, say they get funding from state and local governments. And there are other sources of funding listed throughout. about 14% in the sample. So that I think 13 of 92 respondents say they have received E-rate, which we know is a very important potential source of funding for increasing the capacity of tribal libraries to offer public computers and broadband access. And some of you have seen this slide before. The data that we know from 2021 is that there are fewer tribal librarians who have never heard of E-rate. So that means that there are more that have heard of it. So that's good news for 2021. I think what is less good news is that there's still a large number reporting that the application is complicated and that they're unsure whether or not they qualify. So clearly there's still some work to do on E-rate, and I know that that's been a big focus of ATOM, IMLS, and others in the big push for improved infrastructure of tribal libraries around technology in Indian country. I don't have anything more to say. I've spoken for my whole time. I just wanted to say thank you and keep your eyes peeled to the ATOM website for full and final information about the report when it's released. It's probably just a few weeks from now going to be fully released. So thank you very much.
Wow, that's a lot of really great info in there. Thank you so much for sharing with that and for your work that goes into that really detail-oriented analysis of all the data, the outreach to make sure that you're getting representation from the right people and putting that all together in such a usable way for us. I really, really appreciate that. We want to open it up for some questions, but first when I think back to the first survey, and I really eagerly read that report over and over again, because it was really the only data that we really had that described this need and this particular need of tribal libraries as opposed to rural libraries or other libraries in different contexts. And one part that I thought was so interesting was about the support of the tribal government, or the perception of support of the government for library services. And I didn't really see that mentioned in this, this 2021 report, but I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that relationship, or the ability for a library to advocate for their own tech needs to tribal governments, or those who are making decisions about the budget process in terms of some of those barriers to PC access or to broadband access.
Thanks for that question, Nicole. We didn't ask that question explicitly this year about perceptions of support from the tribal libraries, the government, the tribal government that is its government. But you can see from that funding support question that you would hope that a tribal library, that 100% of tribal libraries report that their tribal government was a funder. Only 64% are reporting that their tribal government is a funder. So there's clearly room for advocacy there. And I think that it's really important for us to also go back to some of the open-ended questions. And there is some indication in the open-ended answers that this remains a struggle, at least for some tribal librarians, to get that kind of support from their tribal governments. So there is some important advocacy work to do there. And I think that it exists for me, I think, on at least two fronts. One of those fronts is back to this digital citizenship and digital inclusion, that it's tribal citizens are going to be left behind if they don't have these kinds of accesses at their library, and tribal governments need to make sure that they're taking care of their citizens that way and making sure that they can provide these kinds of resources to them. And if they can't afford themselves to invest in the libraries, doing everything they can to help make access to federal grants and programs available to tribal libraries. But I think the other reason is not just the digital inclusion aspect, but the aspect that tribal libraries themselves are spaces where tribal culture is so curated and made accessible to citizens. And while that's more obvious in the pure survey of tribal libraries, that it's not the broadband survey, one of the things that really rises to the top in the broadband and technology survey is how interested tribal citizens are in Ancestry.com and those kinds of online databases. So supporting the tribal library is also a way to support culture and identity and tribal nationhood. And that's an argument and an advocacy argument that I think is just critically important that tribal leadership needs to understand.
Let's say that louder for those in the back, right? Thanks so much. I'm trying to keep keep hold of the chat as well. I see a lot of expressions of thanks for you in the chat. I don't see any questions other than if it's possible to get the slides, but we know that Atom will be able to share these out after the workshop. I'm going to give one more second for questions before I follow up with another one. Feel free to, we've got space for you to unmute if you'd like to ask your question to Miriam out loud, or you can type your question in the chat as well.
Hi, Miriam. My name is Sandra. I work for U of A. We're implementing a new project on digital literacies and coding for Native communities, youth, and teachers. I'm curious as to, in your work with tribal libraries, how are they implementing that, like bringing digital literacies? I know you talked a little bit about that, and maybe possibly coding in your spaces within tribal libraries. I am from the reservation in northern Arizona, and I know there's very limited tribal libraries where I'm from and access to that as well. But yeah, I just want to learn a little bit more about that in your work.
So we didn't ask explicitly about coding, but I do think that the demand for online training is starting to push us in that direction. Like, what are people asking for? And some of that does show up in the comments as well. But there's also, you can see some of the desires for new kinds of access to digital services too, as I talked more about what libraries don't have and versus some of what they do have. But we're starting to see just that edge of tribal libraries developing tech labs and maker spaces, and so, smaller percentages of tribal libraries have those things, but my sense is that those things are going to be growing. We've already seen a slight growth of them over the last decade, and because there's more concentration on those kinds of STEM skills, I think there's going to be more demand that tribal libraries offer those kinds of things. Yeah, that's not really a full answer to your question because we didn't ask really specifically about coding programs and training around coding, but you can start to see the sort of edges of those kinds of needs and demands and the answers to the demands for, or the requests for technology training and the kinds of things that some libraries are starting to offer in terms of maker spaces and tech labs.
So Nicole, we had one more question, or a couple more questions. Someone asked, would being they are currently a tribal library, and would it be wise to go public?
I think that's a question for the library experts here, the tribal library experts. I'm a survey person.
Yes. So then let's go ahead and maybe we can circle back to that in a little bit. One of the other questions is working with the Internet Society to expand internet into our underserved communities, digital literacy and development of digital divide. Is there any grant funding to teach people about cybersecurity and how to be safe with personally identifiable information? And if anybody has any answers to these questions, feel free to put them in chat. Because this may not be specific to Miriam, or maybe one of the other presenters later on could be able to answer this. Oh, and it looks like that Sue McNeil in the chat said that the session on E-rate later today, they'd be happy to have a conversation about the resources available. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to check out Breakout Room 2 later this afternoon.
Okay. Well, some fantastic questions. I want to know the answer too, so we can spread the word about using federal funding to support all those extra services that go into providing access. You know, yes, the cybersecurity, but also those internal upgrades and network security as well for that library infrastructure. So some good things to ponder. Thank you so much, Miriam, for sharing all of that with us, for being available to work through some of these questions with people who want to follow up with you, for sharing the resources and for your ongoing work. I really appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Alrighty. We're going to go ahead and transition to our next presenter now. So, you know, the name of this workshop is, you know, digital inclusion, right? But we haven't really gotten into the meats of what we mean when we talk about digital inclusion. Yes, it's Wi-Fi and hotspots and learning, but how does that all come together? We're really fortunate to be joined with by some representatives from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who have been a long-term player and advocate at the national level for those doing the work on the ground, and they're big supporters of libraries as well. I'm really pleased to introduce to you Pamela Rosales with NDIA. She's the Training and Community Engagement Manager, and she's here to give us a nice overview of digital inclusion.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Nicole. I will go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. All right. Everybody can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. And then let me just get my chat ready. Okay, perfect. So thank you again, Nicole, for the introduction. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Digital Inclusion 101 portion. For today's agenda, in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to cover the basics of digital inclusion by going over basic terminology, then talking about the barriers to digital inclusion and the solutions towards digital equity. And then we're going to look at some examples of digital inclusion programs. Again, my name is Pamela Rosales, pronouns she, hers. I am the Training and Community Engagement Manager with NDIA, and I am based out in the Windy City of Chicago. So who is NDIA? National Digital Inclusion Alliance is what NDIA stands for, and we advance digital equity by supporting community programs and equipping policymakers to act. We are a nonprofit representing and serving more than 700 US organizations in 47 states, working for affordable broadband, access to devices, and digital skills training and support. We are here because we believe that with digital equity, we all win. So let's first talk about some 3 important terms when building our foundational knowledge about what digital equity is. You might have heard some of these terms used interchangeably, but they each mean clear and specific things. So the first term is digital equity. It's a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. That participation can look like feeling confident, showing up in a virtual interview, knowing that your internet is stable and reliable. But it can also look like knowing how to go on Facebook Live to record a hate crime in order to protect yourself. Digital equity is more than just learning how to use a keyboard or having internet access or an updated device. It's also about reclaiming power, especially for us marginalized folks. Think about the ways that digital equity gives power back to survivors and gives them a platform to hold their abusers accountable and spark the #MeToo movement. This is why we do the work that we do, so that everybody can participate online in the way that they want to, if they want to. All right, so now we're gonna talk about digital inclusion. Digital equity is the goal, digital inclusion is the work. It's how we get there. It's the activities necessary to achieve digital equity. And it's the work that you are all doing. We'll go into detail in the next few slides about what exactly those activities look like. And so while digital equity is the goal, digital inclusion is the work, we are now here at the digital divide, and it's the issue. It's the gap between those who have affordable access, skills, and support to effectively engage online and those who do not. The digital divide disproportionately affects those who are already impacted by oppressive systems like racism, classism, colonialism, etc. And because broadband isn't viewed as a civil right and utility for everyone to meet their basic needs, and instead you see major internet service providers viewing broadband with profit as the end goal, you see that the digital divide is impacting people of color, indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and households with low income being more digitally excluded. And as practitioners, we also get to decide if we perpetuate this divide, right? It can be easy to point our fingers to institutions and companies, but we as practitioners and advocates also have a power and a say on whether or not our organizations and our interactions with the communities and our patrons that we serve perpetuate racism and colonialism and harm. For example, are the solutions being created by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in your community, or are they only viewed and seen as a client? So terms and language around the issue can also perpetuate harm as well. So terms like a digital immigrant, when classifying somebody's digital skills, we need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of using terms centered around citizenship, and what type of solutions would come from looking at the digital divide through a colonial framework? So the digital divide and systemic racism go hand in hand. And in 2020, NDIA published a white paper on how limiting broadband investment to rural-only communities discriminates against Black Americans and other people of color. And in it, we highlight that the excessive focus on broadband deployment into rural areas, which are predominantly white, non-Hispanic populated areas, and the lack of deployment into urban and other communities, this policy framework is counterproductive and structurally racist because in general, non-Hispanic white Americans are more likely than other racial groups to have broadband subscriptions, while Black Americans, Indigenous peoples, and other people of color are less likely. Another important term is digital redlining, and this contributes greatly to the digital divide. Digital redlining is the discrimination by internet service providers, or ISPs for short, in deployment, maintenance, upgrade, or delivery of services. So in lower income communities, they don't receive the service that higher income communities get. And this is because internet service providers view it as a commercial service and don't necessarily have to view internet service access as a civil right. Therefore, there's no need to serve everybody equitably. So let's look at the map on the right. In 2017, NDIA, alongside Connect Your Community in Cleveland, conducted a mapping analysis of FCC broadband availability in Cleveland, Ohio. And we found that AT&T systemically discriminated against lower income Cleveland neighborhoods in its deployment of home internet and video technologies over the past decade. So the picture shows that in Cleveland, the red are the neighborhoods with high poverty rates. The green is where the fiber enhanced broadband improvements were made. And ultimately you can see that AT&T withheld that fiber enhanced broadband improvement for most Cleveland neighborhoods with high poverty rates. And this is indicative of so many urban areas and a problem impacting low income communities the most. So now we're going to talk about some key barriers to digital inclusion. But it wouldn't be a presentation done by me if it wasn't with some fun. So we got 3 trivia questions for our next 30 minutes. And now we're gonna ask the first one, okay? So studies show that $10 per month is the most low-income Americans can afford to pay for the internet. However, the most popular broadband plan costs an average of how much a month? You could either put the answer in the chat or you can just think of it yourself, but the selections are A, $58.79, B, $68.96. I see a lot of folks in the chat saying B, okay. C, $27.49, or D, $47.15. We got a lot of B's, few D's. All right. Okay, I'm gonna give you a few seconds. 3, 2, 1. If you answer D, that's actually the correct answer. So the average broadband plan is $47.15. However, the most that low-income Americans can afford a month is $10. think about that discrepancy. But the fastest broadband plan, and that's what we want, right? We don't just want internet access, we want it to be fast and reliable. That's actually $68.96. So for a lot of folks saying B, you're on the right track. And the fact that a broadband subscription is not affordable for a household is a primary reason why 28 million households across the country lack broadband in their homes. All right. So broadband access is a civil rights issue because it impacts nearly all fundamental aspects of our lives. When everyone has access to affordable high-speed internet, it means improvements in things like accessibility. For example, people who are blind or visually impaired can use screen reader programs that audibly describe website material to users. Broadband includes improvement in things like public health through telehealth and digital health. Civic engagement increases through voting and community organizing, as well as entertainment, right? I truly believe that everybody deserves the opportunity to scroll endlessly through TikTok till 2 in the morning. That shouldn't be deserved or restricted or reserved only for people who can afford that. Everybody should be able to have that entertainment available to them. And broadband equity, it's not the same as availability. So availability is simply the question of, can you get connected to the internet? And just because the infrastructure exists in a community, it doesn't necessarily tell us who's adopting or utilizing that internet at home. And availability also isn't taking into consideration the price of that connection, the speed of the connection, or if it's reliable. So the last thing I'll cover when it comes to broadband is the difference between unserved and underserved. You might have heard those terms before. So unserved is an area that has no broadband infrastructure. So folks in that area cannot get connected. There's no wire on the ground that comes to their house to connect to broadband, or there are no cell phone towers to reach their house for them to have access to a hotspot. And underserved, on the other hand, is the significant gaps and variances in internet speed, reliability, and affordability. So a person could get connected to the internet, but there are a lot of factors limiting that or hindering their experience. So for example, which you see a lot is the internet connection is too slow and it's unaffordable. So there are a lot of communities that are paying $130 a month for internet subscription, but they can't even send an email because the bandwidth is too small, it's too slow. So that's tackling unaffordability, and it's not reliable, and it's super expensive. Just because a subscription is high, just because you're paying a lot for internet doesn't necessarily mean you're getting good quality high-speed internet. Another one is the technology. So the technology used to connect to the internet would be unreliable because it either goes out when it's bad weather, making it unreliable. So a question I want to ask you all to think about, you could either answer it internally or in the chat. If everyone had access to fast and reliable internet, would that solve the digital divide? Yes. A lot of folks in the chat are saying no, absolutely, you're all right, you're all there. So the answer is no. And there are other barriers that need to be addressed in order to get people to using the internet in the way that they want to. Leonardo, you're right, definitely, it is a start. So another barrier to digital equity is affordable, adequate, and appropriate devices. So the digital divide and device ownership disproportionately impacts people with disabilities, as only 62% of adults with a disability own a desktop or a laptop device compared to 81% of adults without a disability. And looking more into accessibility, smart homes connected to smart devices like speakers, refrigerators, and thermostats help people with disabilities have more autonomy and control over their daily actions. So to tackle this barrier, devices have to be affordable, adequate, and appropriate. Affordability allows for everybody to have access, to actually have ownership over these devices. Adequate, because I'm sure you all know, just because something is affordable doesn't necessarily mean it's the right device or it's the most updated device, right? And appropriate, because not every device will work for your client's needs, your patron's needs, and we'll go over the pros and cons of a smartphone, tablet, and laptop in the next few slides. All right. Another barrier to digital equity is digital skills. If someone has reliable internet and the newest device, but they don't know how to access the internet and navigate the device, it's still incomplete. So we've all seen this since the pandemic started, that remote work is driving demand for digital skills. And in 2019, report done by the US Department of Health, or US Department of Education, they found that 52 million adults do not have necessary digital skills, which is about 16% of the US population. And they also found that 74% of US adults use a computer at home, and 81% of adults use a computer in everyday life. Digital skills can financially improve someone's life, absolutely, but outside of a job, having digital skills allows folks to FaceTime with their community, reconnect with their history and their culture, check the balance on their credit card, or meet with their doctor virtually. So now that we've gone over the key barriers that contribute to the digital divide, we can identify the solutions to help towards reaching digital equity, which is these three things. They're not the only things, but they're covering the basic barriers, which is affordable broadband, appropriate and affordable devices, and digital skills training. So we're going to cover each one in detail. Solution number one, affordable and low cost broadband. But before we dive into that, we got another trivia question for you. Okay, so the question here is, students who lack access to devices and broadband services have, on average, GPAs that are blank points lower than their peers with reliable access. Is it A, 0.4, B, 1 full point, C, 0.25, or D, 0.73 points? I'm seeing a mix of answers in the chat. All right, I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. 3, 2, 1. If your answer was A, you are correct. So students who lack access to devices and broadband services have, on average, GPAs that are 0.4 lower points than their peers with reliable access. So what does that actually mean? This academic gap leads to 4 to 6% lower expected annual income, amounting to 1.4 to 2K lower annual income. Okay, therefore, closing the digital divide contributes to breaking the cycle of poverty. Let's define what broadband is. So broadband is when you have connectivity that is strong, and often that is wireline that comes into your home. It's the transmission of wide bandwidth data over a high-speed internet connection. And the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, defines the minimum standard for broadband speed to be 25 megabits per second for downloading and 3 megabits per second for uploading. However, as you can see, that was defined in 2015, and I'm sure you all know 7 years later, that definition for speed is not enough. They're too slow. So for example, if you have 3 to 4 people in your home, and you have 4 to 6 devices connected to the internet, so think of laptops, smartphones, tablets, gaming consoles, and other smart devices. Let's say you have 2 students or 2 individuals either working from home or taking online courses. You're streaming videos in HD, not even 4K, HD, and you occasionally play video games. You're actually going to be needing 100 megabits per second for downloading, not 25. And that's the reality for most folks. So earlier, I asked if free access to fast and reliable internet would solve the digital divide, and we know that's not the case. Having the infrastructure put in place so that everyone has the fast and strong internet access at home doesn't necessarily mean they're going to use it. And that's where the term broadband adoption is critical. So broadband adoption is daily access to the internet at high speeds, quality, and capacity necessary to accomplish the tasks that folks want to and need, whether that is streaming Netflix, sending emails, working from home, going to remote classes, things like that. It's also digital skills, having the digital skills necessary to participate online, and on a personal device that is on a secure and convenient network. All right, we've got the final trivia question. So if you didn't get the first two right, here's your way to redeem yourself. All right, so what city was ranked the best work from home city in 2021 by PC Mag? Is it A, San Francisco, B, New York, C, San Antonio, or D, Chattanooga, Tennessee? We've got some A's, some C's, some D's. Oh, getting a lot of A's. All right, I'm loving the participation, y'all. Okay, I'm gonna give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. If you answered D, Chattanooga, you are correct. So Chattanooga, Tennessee, also known as the Gig City. Yay to Amy Ellingson, happy for you. So Chattanooga is the first city in the country to roll out a citywide fiber network in 2010. And during the pandemic, they were able to provide free high-speed Wi-Fi to approximately 28,500 students with their HCS Ed Connect program. All right, so over here with NDIA, we love to create useful toolkits and resources to help you all with your digital equity work. And I will be sharing these slides, and everything is hyperlinked here. So if you're a fan of the hyperlink, I got you. So here are some awesome resources by NDIA from listening to our community. We first have the free and low cost internet tool, which is perfect for you all digital inclusion practitioners who are giving guidance to your patrons. In it, you'll see providers, coverage maps, how to apply to get the internet access, and more information about each internet provider. Recently, our policy team just launched our Affordable Connectivity Program research page, which tells you everything you need to know. ACP, for sure, it's a broadband affordability program that provides a discount of up to $30 per month for non-tribal households and $75 per month for tribal households on their internet bill. And lastly, we have a broadband research base, which is a collection of academic and practitioner research on the impact of broadband access. All right, so the next two will be talking about appropriate and affordable devices. So each device has their strength and weakness, and it all depends on what your patron needs. So it just takes a little bit of asking questions to figure out what they're looking for. So here are some pros and cons. Mobile phones, they're really great because they're small, they're portable, right? They're easy to carry around for most folks. There's a long battery life, and to charge them, you don't really need this long, lanky thing, right? But it does not replace a laptop. And sometimes folks think that, where they think they can, everything can be replaced from a laptop with their device of a smartphone when doing things like online presentations, remote learning, or working from home, but that's not necessarily the case. But if your patrons' focus is more about, light internet browsing and using apps, and that's the perfect device for them. Next, we have a tablet. This is great for binge watching those Netflix and Hulu series. They have a great long battery life. The touchscreen may be an accessibility issue, or it could be a big accessibility pro for folks, just depending on their accessibility needs, because they do have that bigger keyboard on there. But unless you have a fancy cellular data plan on it, you can't make calls. And there are also certain apps on it that just don't work for a tablet. TikTok is just really awkward on a tablet, okay? And then lastly, but not least, because there's a desktop, but I didn't put it on here, but we have laptops. So if your community member or patron is looking to work from home, this device is perfect for them. There's large storage files. However, the battery life is shorter because it does take a lot of power. And affordability wise, out of the two, it's the most expensive. So you just have to ask, what is your patron looking to get out of the internet, and then go from there. All right, so one awesome example is Tech Exchange from Oakland. So this awesome organization, they work to ensure that all families have computer, internet access, and technology skills to improve their lives. So their Tech Nights program assists families with signing up for affordable internet. They provide a digital skills workshop and a free refurbished computer to those who attend. And they also have a Tech for Housing program where they provide digital skills training to 10 different public housing sites across the Bay Area. And again, NDIA, we're here for you with the tools and resources. And this one is the Startup Manual. So you'll learn more about communal digital inclusion programs, some key questions to start if you're interested in starting one. And also we have examples in there for do-it-yourself refurbishing and working with established nonprofit refurbishers. And the last thing here we'll talk about is digital skills training. So if folks have access to reliable internet and appropriate device, what's the missing piece? It's those skills. And the Essential Digital Skills Framework is a framework that NDIA recommends when breaking down the building blocks of digital skills. So for example, does your client know how to turn their device on and off? When it comes to a mouse, do they understand what right click means, what scroll means? Do they know how to check the battery percentage, and do they know when it means to charge their battery, right? Like, don't wait till 5%, that type of thing, right? Other skills, foundational skills, is do they know how to connect their device to a Wi-Fi that is secure? Do they know how to update and change their password when prompted to do so? For some folks who do not have those skills, changing their password to get on their human resources page to do a training, that can be a whole ordeal. And for some, it literally takes a few seconds. So building those skills up for them can be really crucial, and it can save them a lot of time as well and a lot of heartache. So here, the link here goes over some essential digital skills framework that I really recommend you to look over because it can help you when building those skills for your community, your patrons there. So an organization that is providing great digital skills training is Community Tech Network. So their San Francisco Connected program provides in-person digital literacy training for adults and people with disability, older adults, I mean. So they cover subjects like internet safety, voter registration, the basics of getting onto social media, video calling, and digital tutoring. And on top of that, their trainings are available in 5 different languages. And this is a great example of what building a digital skills program looks like for your community and learning their needs and their interests. And there is the picture of the recent graduates. And then for NDIA resources, we have an awesome blog post called 5 Digital Literacy Resources You Need to Know About. So here are 4 of the 5. You want to know the last one, you better click on that link when you get it. So on the left column, if you are looking for self-paced multilingual resources, digitallearn.org and GCF Learn are free resources for you. And then on the right are resources for facilitators like yourselves to use and learn more from, so you can learn how to provide instructions to your patrons and how to teach these essential skills the most efficiently. Tomorrow, during one of the breakout sessions, Abby Wildrop, our digital navigator model, will discuss more about our digital navigators program. So I highly recommend you tune in then. But our digital navigators program was developed as a result of COVID for organizations and entities that needed to continue their serving their community during socially distant time. And a digital navigator is someone trained to assess a community member's needs and completely guide them towards resources that are suitable for their skill level and lifestyle. They are not the Geek Squad, y'all, or the Apple Genius Bar, okay? You're not Sheldon from whatever that show is, where you're gatekeeping the information and you have to know all the ins and outs of coding. No, it's a real person asking and answering the patron's needs through compassion. All right. So last but not least, we'll cover coalitions, because know that you're not alone when you're doing digital equity work. And there are a lot of coalitions out there with really awesome models for you to learn more about. So coalitions, what are they? They are a collective of organizations like local governments, libraries like yourselves, education institutions, housing authorities, social services, etc. They operate in a public realm with a certain degree of transparency about their activities, governance, and finances. Here are some of the role of coalitions. So there's an advocacy effect. You're not alone. You're all working together, which helps create awareness for the community's needs when it comes to broadband affordability, access, device needs, and et cetera. There's also the alignment effect, and then the networking effect. You're bringing a range of parties together in one room. Coalitions are great because they set the stage for member organizations to better understand each other's needs and perspectives. But it only works when you have everybody in your community in there, right? In the table making those decisions. And here's our last awesome resource for you. It's our recently updated coalition guidebook. We updated it this year, and it's jam-packed with juicy coalition info about how coalitions form, how they're structured, best practices for successful models, and ways that coalitions adapt over time. So please do download and read more about that. And last but not least, I would love for you all to join the NDIA's thriving community. There are 3 ways that you can join. You can become an affiliate, a friend, or subscriber, depending on your organization type. And the affiliate and friend, you are there for free. You get access to our monthly newsletter, access to our popular community listserv. Think of it as a group chat where you get a lot of support from other folks doing the same work as you. And you also get access to community calls that I host. So if you enjoyed this, you can meet me there. And then our last one, we had members from the FCC come and answer really important questions from our community that we were able to upload into our frequently asked questions page and our affordable connectivity program research page. So that's it for me. I try to cram in as much information there for you. But here is my contact information. Reach out to me if you have any questions and you want to learn more. But thank you all for participating. You're all a really great crowd. And please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you all so much.
Pamela, wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that and learning us as well. You really combined a lot of my favorite elements, humor and a call for systemic change, and some real resources that we can use right away. So thank you so much. I wish we had some time for questions, because I'm sure you could have some really rich conversations with everybody here, but unfortunately we've got to move along to our next presenter. But thank you for sharing your email. Hopefully people will take advantage of you and of NDIA's resources and will reach out. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your, Pamela's kind enough to be calling in from leave, so we really appreciate that.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Take care. That last presentation really shared a lot of pretty stark national data about connectivity and the rates of broadband deployment. But a lot of us know that this doesn't necessarily capture what's going on in Indian country in a very meaningful way, because we've got unique needs and sometimes just a history of being underrepresented and undercounted in those areas. So I'm really thrilled to introduce E.J. John from the American Indian Policy Institute at ASU, Arizona State University. He's going to give us an overview of what does this landscape of broadband and digital access look like in Indian country today. EJ?
All right, thank you. Again, my name is E.J. John. I'm a research and policy analyst here at the American Indian Policy Institute at ASU, and we're located in Phoenix, Arizona at the ASU downtown Phoenix campus. So thank you all for having me here today, and really looking forward to speaking with you all. Let me just bring up these slides really quick. Okay, are you all able to see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So today just want to go over some quick information about kind of the broadband deployment implementation on Indian country. So we'll go through a quick introduction about AIPI and our work. Then we'll go into some of the programs and some key programs and implementation that's going on right now. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So again, we are the American Indian Policy Institute. We are an institute focused on tribally driven informed policymaking. And we are a small institute with a handful of employees, but we cover a lot of different areas. Broadband is actually one of the areas of that we have a lot of special expertise in right now. But we've also worked on a couple of different other subjects such as voting rights and climate change. But this slide kind of covers a lot of our mission and our values and the vision for the work that we do here. Of course, I'll make these slides available, so I'll go ahead and switch to the next one. There's a lot of reading there, so you can go ahead and check that out later on. This is our director, Dr. Morris. Dr. Morris has been our executive director here at AIPI, and under her leadership, AIPI has really grown to be an authoritative voice in broadband and telecommunications on Indian country. Her experience has really brought our institute into the spotlight for a lot of these issues, and she's been working on a ton of these digital access issues and just kind of telecommunication and broadband connectivity on Indian countries. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen her and heard from her before. She's a really great director, and I'm really proud to join her team here at AIPI. This is me, of course. I've been working here at AIPI for about a year and a little over a year right now. Originally from Vanderwagen, New Mexico, grew up on the Navajo Nation. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. Before joining AIPI, I worked for the tribal government on the Navajo Nation. So my time at Navajo Nation, I had some work in capital projects. And so broadband was definitely a big capital project that we spent a lot of time on, in addition to water lines, power lines, and things like that. So let me go into a little bit of our work with broadband. We have been doing a lot of work in the policy area to try and provide research for different policy initiatives. I think all of you who work on Indian country are really familiar with the struggle to get data. There's just not data available for things when people ask for information like how many people on Indian country have broadband. Well, that's kind of a complicated question, especially when we start talking about things like, what is Indian country? What do you mean by Indian country? What do you mean by tribal communities? When somebody says something like, how many tribal members have access to internet? Well, you know, what do you mean by tribal members? What do you mean by internet? So we've been really trying to kind of narrow down some of those questions and try to provide some of that data where we can. Right before the COVID pandemic hit, our research institute put out the Tribal Technology Assessment in 2019. This was done to kind of begin building some of that data where we went out and we talked to a lot of ASU students about their technology situations back home in their home communities. And it turned out to be a general overview of just broadband connectivity for Indian country. A lot of these students were here in Arizona, so it focused on a lot of the tribal communities here in Arizona. But that kind of laid out some of the base data that was used to try and address the connectivity issues in Indian country for these areas. So that was in 2019, but as you know, throughout the pandemic, we tried to put together more and more information, and that led to a lot of our work putting out policy briefs that looked at a lot of the different federal legislation that came out, a lot of the new broadband programs, a lot of the new examining a lot of the issues that have existed before COVID with broadband connectivity, such as maps and data, making sure that those are accurate and they reflect the situation on the ground in Indian country, so that we could, so that whoever was looking at the information could use it to adequately address the challenges that they were trying to solve. So, and then another part of our work is also just analyzing a lot of the data that's collected. So there's always data that's coming out from the FCC, from different federal agencies, and we want to try and look at those to form additional policy recommendations and to make sure that broadband connectivity can continue to expand and be more available to our tribal communities. One thing that we put together over the last year or so is this tribal broadband resources page. It's a tab on our website, and there's a link at the bottom of the slide, so you can go ahead and check that out when you have some time. But this resources page, we wanted to put it together as a single website that people who work for tribes, tribal governments, tribal entities could look at to get an idea of all that was out there. When anything that we developed, such as our tribal broadband policy priorities, we put together that document and put it on that page, as well as our technology assessment that I talked about that came out in 2019. That's available on that page. All of our policy briefs where we look at different funding programs and the rules and regulations that surround those programs are available there. We also have a weekly, we try to make it weekly, but a blog that comes out, every week or so that examines different parts of broadband. If there's any kind of news or announcements that come out, we try to take note of those. Any kind of urgent or pressing developments, we try to make note of that and try to convey any kind of important information that comes out from either federal government or even state governments here in Arizona. We try to make sure we highlight those and put those on our resources page. We also try to make it a collection of other resources that are available out there outside of our own work. There's some examples such as the ILSR Indigenous Future Zones report, which was a kind of a case study that looked at the tribal broadband implementation from tribally owned internet service providers, ISPs. So that's a really good report to see how tribes have kind of developed their own internet service entities and how they use that to make sure that their communities are connected. There's also available on there the ISOC Internet Society Broadband Policy Priorities, which also addresses the needs for tribal communities and indigenous communities. So let me get into some of the key programs that are kind of coming up this time of year. There was a lot of federal initiatives that came out to really promote broadband connectivity, not just connectivity, but also some of the efforts you heard about this morning, such as data equity or digital equity, and making sure that there's money available to not only provide connection to people, but to try and train people, to train on the technical side, as well as train people to address kind of the human side of making sure people know how to use the internet, they're able to safely navigate the internet. There were programs that were established for cybersecurity. I think earlier there was a question about cybersecurity. There are a couple of cybersecurity aspects in some of these programs. But overall, I mean, out of these 4 pieces of legislation that came out in the last 2 years, there was dozens of programs that could be used for broadband. Some of them focus on education. Some of them were part of programs that focus on housing. Some of them were already existing programs like E-Rate and Reconnect, where they just got additional funding. So to really dig into this would take up a lot more time than I have today. But please check out our website. We have policy briefs and other documents that look into all these different programs and that came out of these different pieces of legislation. And these are links if you want to click on these later and check them out. But the key programs I kind of want to focus on right now is the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. Some people also refer to that as the TBCP. We also want to look at the Digital Equity Access and Deployment Program, Bead Program, and Digital Equity Act programs. So first, let's look at the TBCP. This is probably the main source that tribes are looking towards to fund their broadband projects. This is a program that was set up under the NTIA, which is intended to fund tribal specific programs. When the program was first established, it was appropriated $980 million. And then with the passage of the most recent infrastructure bill, or the IIJA, that bill appropriated an additional $2 billion to that fund, which sounds like a lot of money. However, NTIA reported back in September of last year that they had received 280 applications, and those applications alone totaled $5 billion in requests. So that already has oversubscribed the almost $3 billion that is in that should be available from that fund. So I think we all know, and we're all familiar with, that the need on Indian country is great. There's a great need to invest and build out for broadband infrastructure. So, just looking at these initial numbers from the Tbcp, it doesn't look like the appropriated amounts are going to fully 100% cover those needs, which is usually the case with a lot of these programs, right? It does. It's a good start, but a lot of the times we find that we're still lacking. So, but we'll see how the work progresses. As of yesterday, when I looked up on the NTIA website, they had indicated that there were 14 projects that they have awarded so far, and those awards have totaled about $6 million. So it's good to see that 14 projects have been awarded, and you can look at those on the websites at the bottom of the slide. It'll show you a map and where these projects are located and give you a little description of all of those projects. The next one I want to focus on is the Bead program. This is a state program. It's a state program. It's the part of the infrastructure bill that invested in states building out their broadband infrastructure. That's why the amount is pretty substantial, $42.45 billion for this fund. And it's really meant to close the broadband availability gap. Congress stated in the bill that access to affordable, reliable, high-speed broadband is essential to full participation in modern life in the United States. So that is a very strong statement to show that broadband is important. Broadband connectivity is essential. So under this, the program prioritizes unserved locations, and they define this by areas that do not have access to internet speeds with 25 megabytes download and 3 megabytes upload. They prioritize unserved locations, and these are locations that have no access to 100 megabytes download and 20 megabytes upload. They also prioritize community anchor institutions. So these are things like tribal colleges. They can be libraries. They can be kind of like community service centers, things like that. You just have to look at the definition, and it likely will cover some kind of significant community institution. They also prioritize areas with persistent poverty, high poverty rates, and where the speed of the proposed network and build time and other factors about the projects themselves. But when you look at this list of priorities, there's a lot of overlap with tribal communities, right? A lot of tribal communities also are areas where there is no access to 25/30 internet. If there's no access to 25/3, there's definitely no access to 120. Our tribal communities definitely have community anchor institutions, like I said, tribal colleges, community centers, schools, libraries. And tribal communities, unfortunately do have an overlap where there's persistent poverty and high poverty areas. So even though these are state programs, I think it's really important to remember that our tribal members, our tribal communities, we're state citizens too. We are also entitled to anything that the state is putting together as residents and citizens of the state. And so to that end, the program also requires that states have to develop broadband plans, and these plans have to be approved by NTIA. And hopefully, states keep that in mind when they put these plans together. And that's probably where a lot of advocacy will start coming in to make sure that tribes are included in these state programs. So those of you who have good relationships with your state offices, whether that's like an education department or maybe it's with the governor's office itself, you know, it's time to really start advocating to be part of these plans. And NTIA has been holding some discussions about what it looks like, what tribal involvement might look like when they're looking at these state broadband plans. But we haven't really heard any new information about what their plans are for the development of those rules and regulations. So we'll have to wait to see what that might look like. But even though this is available for states, it's still something that's significant, and it's still something that I think tribal communities should be looking to try and advocate for. And we here at AIPI are also trying to figure out what would the best way, what would be the best practices, you know, the best methods to try and advocate for those at the state level. And we're trying to work with our partners as well to see what that might look like. So hopefully we'll have some more information on that in the near future. But right now we're kind of just examining the initial information coming out about these programs. Okay, the next question, or the next program, are going to be these programs under the Digital Equity Act, which was a part of the infrastructure bill. These again are mostly state programs. You have a state planning grant program, which is about 60 million. The state capacity grant program, which is 1.4 billion, and the competitive grant program, which is 1.25 billion. The way that this program works is it kind of goes through by steps. So first, as a state, you have to develop your planning grant, you put together your equity act, your digital equity plan, and that's what that initial planning grant is for. And then once the state submits that, gets the money for that, then they can start applying for the actual their digital equity plan projects. And then they would start applying for the state capacity grant and the competitive grant. And the competitive grant is open to more than just states. I believe that one is also open to tribes and local governments. So these have different dates when they start, and we'll have to wait for some more information about the final rules when they're released for these programs. But the objective of these Digital Equity Act programs is to, again, support closure of digital divide, promote equity and digital inclusion, so that communities have the information technology and capacity that is needed for full participation in society and economy of the United States. I mean, these are really strong statements about how essential broadband connectivity is. And if that's the intent of the legislation, the intent of the bill, I mean, I just don't see how these state programs can overlook tribes and tribal communities. How can they overlook, you know, citizens of their state? If that's the intent of these bills, you know, they should be including tribes in these discussions. So another aspect of these Digital Equity Act programs is that state governors have to appoint some kind of administrating entity. I know some states have already gotten their broadband offices up and running, and a lot of states are in that process right now. So that, whatever that entity ends up being, whether it's an official state broadband office or something else, this office is allowed to partner with other entities under the Digital Equity Act programs. So they can partner with tribes, they can partner with anchor institutions, they can partner with local governments to put together these digital equity plans and to start implementing their digital equity projects. So that was a quick rundown, and I kind of thought there might be some questions, so I wanted to make sure I reserve some time for questions. So thank you for your time, and yeah, just let me know. I'll put up our contact page. This has our website, our social media. Please feel free to look at those. We have a lot of good information on those, and as well as our contact info on those links as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, EJ. I really appreciate your overview of a lot of different moving parts, and presenting it to us in a good way, and all the resources that AIPI provides for people to refer to. I do see one question in the chat. I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up too bad, but it says, in Alaska, most of the FCC maps needed to apply for much of the NTIA application funding do not exist. Do you know if there are updates to this understanding? So question about, how to allocate that funding, you have to rely on the FCC's mapping data. What happens when that doesn't exist or is known to be inaccurate?
Yes, definitely. FCC maps are not the most accurate, of course. I think we've definitely seen how examples of that and how that causes issues. Right now, the FCC, I think it was in the Infrastructure Act, they were given some funding to fix their maps, to fix their mapping and to make sure that they're more accurate. So the way that the FCC is doing this is they are opening up a data collection. They're opening up data collection for their maps, basically, and they're allowing tribes to submit their own mapping information. And once it goes through that FCC data collection process, then that is what will be used as the map that FCC will refer to. So that's one process that the FCC is putting together right now. They do have a Federal Registry notice out that came out about a month ago pertaining to this data collection program. We're still kind of looking at it, and we'll probably release some information on that soon, maybe in the next couple of weeks, to kind of look at that a little more in depth and to give a little guidance on how to be part of the program and to submit accurate, your community's accurate information to the program.
Thank you. We've got a couple more minutes here with EJ. I'd like to invite you to unmute and ask a question, or go ahead and type it in the chat. We got the policy expert in the house, so let's take advantage of that.
This is Lisa Sutherland. I work with the Alaska Federation of Natives. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for this program. We're about ready to get a NTIA grant to do a broadband use and adoption throughout our 229 tribes in Alaska. And so we really welcome these resources that you have available. But I also wanted, in looking at the law, as he mentioned, for the digital equity plan that each state has to prepare, the governor is required to designate a kind of a disadvantaged community to put together the state plan and administer the money, as I understand it. And that could be a tribal community, it could be another minority community, veterans, disabled, elderly, people living in public housing. There's a whole kind of series of groups, but in states, especially that have large Indian populations, it makes a lot of sense for Indian organizations to request to administer, A, write the plan in consult with those other groups, and B, administer the money. So I just wanted to make sure that kind of my understanding is correct and make other people aware that this is like a huge opportunity to run the broadband use and adoption for your whole state. Thank you.
Yeah, that's our understanding as well. If you look at both the Bead and the Digital Equity Act, they both have some kind of baseline initial grants to the states. But then once those initial grants go out, there's a competitive aspect to it. For Bead, there's an initial amount that goes to all the states and territories. And then there's a competitive aspect. For digital equity, there's amounts that go out for that digital planning aspect of it. And then the competitive grant comes in, and that's where states have to put together their digital equity plan. And that's where it's graded to see if they prioritize those issues like reaching communities with no access and taking into account the areas of their state where, you know, they need to really improve the infrastructure and the broadband access. So like I said, you know, that those are in the bill. That's the language in the bill, but we haven't seen what the final rules look like from the program from NTIA yet. NTIA is administering these programs. So once NTIA is done putting together their proposed rules and all of those documents, then we'll be able to get a better idea of what that criteria might look like or how that mechanism might work. So that's just kind of our understanding right now after just reading the overall language of the bill.
Yeah, in a tribal consultation they did with Alaska tribes, they told us that their notice of funding opportunity will come out, I think May 17th for the digital equity $2.5 billion for the initial kind of planning, you know, aspect and how that program will work. And also I think for the middle mile program, that will come out on May 17th as well as what we were advised.
Yeah. We I wrote down in my notes spring 2022. So hopefully, you know, it's coming out soon. We'll see.
All right. Thank you so much, EJ, for sharing that with us and for all of these resources. There's a couple more questions in the chat that we aren't able to get to right now. I don't know if you're able to follow up with those people in the chat or another time. We've got your contact info as well. But at this point, you know, we've heard 3 pretty powerful presentations, and we're going to go ahead and take our 10-minute break before we move on to our breakout rooms and hear from some more presenters. We do plan to start promptly at the top of the hour, wherever you're located in. We'll all join back in this main Zoom room, and you'll be able to select one of the 2 breakout rooms that we have set up for you. So if you're able to, join a little bit early so we can make sure that our presenters get to start right on time. Thanks, everyone.
For all of my breakout room presenters, I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms. So if you want to, you know, get your PowerPoints pulled up or anything like that, you know, and just get settled, I'll go ahead and do that now. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
No problem.
Sounds good, Melissa. I'm here. This is Carson.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Hello, Melissa. It's Donovan Pete.
Hey, Donovan. So glad you're here. So I went ahead and opened it. You should see it down in the area. It'll have a little breakout room and you select the one you need to go into. If you can't get into it, let me know. I'm happy to add you.
Okay. Would it be tech in the library?
Yes. Go ahead. I'm going to switch this now. Switch the slide. This also makes it easy.
Okay, all right,
I know, cheat sheets, right?
definitely.
All right, I'll go over to tech in the library too. This is Carson.
Perfect. Thank you, Carson.
Melissa, are you there?
Yes.
So when people come back, are you just going to have them go in the rooms?
Yes. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I have the breakout rooms open now so the presenters could go in there. So now when people come back, I'll say that the breakout rooms are open. If we click on more, they should be able to see where they want to go into. But if they can't, then I'm happy to add them to a breakout room.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move into breakout room 2 then.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks.
Melissa, do you need me to stay out for a while and help you?
Yeah, well, it would be helpful maybe for like a minute or two when we get back. Sure. So Winona, I can go ahead and add you to room 1, not a problem. If anyone who's here, you're welcome to go ahead and move into the breakout rooms. On your Zoom toolbar, you should see where it says more, and then it kind of says breakout rooms. If you click that, then you should be able to join the one you want. If there is a breakout room, if you're having a hard time getting into one, I am happy to add you. Just feel free to pop it in the chat or talk out loud.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Melissa.
No problem.
Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for day 1 of this workshop. I'd like to thank Crosby Kemper, Miriam Jorgensen, Pamela Rosales, EJ John, Lisa Regala, Pamela Van Helsema, Ada Wren Mitchell, Joe Misterovich, Carson Block, Donovan Pete, Sue Sullivan, Kate Dumichel, and Molly O'Connor for sharing your time and your expertise with us. You know, there was a lot of information to pack into 4 hours. I know a lot of us have a lot to digest and think about and are armed with a few more questions. As I was listening to the presentations today, there were a few questions that jumped out to me as well, like, you know, well, how do we know that we're getting the level of internet service that we're actually paying for? Like, how can we track that, and what can we be armed with when we talk to our service providers about that discrepancy? How can we make sure that our community members have the right devices that they need and aren't relying on a cell phone to meet their daily needs? How can we involve more young people in building networks and exploring all the possibilities of technology in their communities? And how can we transform libraries into community spaces beyond books into really engaging and meaningful ways long into the future? How can we make the most use of federal funding, both longstanding programs such as E-rate administered by the FCC, and all this incoming funding like the Digital Equity Act money that is going to be administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration? And importantly, what are the resources and support that exist for small libraries that have limited capacity to apply and manage these funds? All of us in this room have something to share, and we also know of a lot of resources that can be helpful and useful for others. At the end of the day tomorrow, we've actually scheduled in a Skillshare and open forum where we've highlighted some questions that were included in registration, as well as questions that have been coming up today throughout the sessions. So we're hoping to crowdsource some of these answers and to share experience with others along these topics. So please be prepared to share links and resources and anecdotes in the afternoon session. We've got another full day tomorrow where we'll hear from folks from IMLS. We'll hear from people doing some good work in community archives projects. We'll hear about meeting people where they're at in terms of digital literacy training through programs called digital Navigators, who are one-stop shop for digital inclusion, connectivity, and online learning. And I wonder if we'll also hear some stories from libraries who are doing different types of programming, whether that's ebook resources or using language in the library and leveraging technology to provide those resources. So I hope that you all have a great evening, and we're excited to see you tomorrow. I don't want to misspeak and say it's the same link, but you should have another Zoom link for tomorrow's session coming at you in the morning.
And it is actually the same link, Nicole.
Perfect. Thanks, Melissa.
But yes, you will get another 1 hour reminder email.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.